Greetings and salutations, young true believers. So, today we will talk about Immanuel Kant's moral theory known as deontology. Deontology comes from a Greek root, deon, duty, and this is the crux of Kant's ethics, right? He thinks that morality is not, as utilitarians would have it, primarily about human happiness and making for the happiest number of people, the greatest number of people happy, right? A happy society. Rather, for Kant, morality is about what we have to do regardless of how we feel about it, right? So, a prime assumption of many moral theorists throughout history has been that doing your moral duty should make you happy. For Kant, by contrast, if doing your moral duty makes you absolutely miserable, you still have to do your moral duty. So, where to begin? Because there's a lot to talk about with Kant. Kant identifies human freedom, free will, as identical with behaving morally. To the extent that you behave morally, to that same extent, you are free. And if you choose to forego morality, then you are acting, in Kant's words, as a beast of the field, right? And you're not worthy of the consideration that's due to a human, right? Um, so, what does morality consist in? Well, unlike, and I think I mentioned this yesterday, contra the utilitarian philosophers, for Kant, morality is about the intentions behind the action rather than the consequences. Um, if doing your moral duty, right, again, results in disastrous consequences, but you did it with a good will, you had a good heart, you had good intentions, then that action still has moral worth on Kant's view, regardless of the consequences, right? Now, that having been said, John Stuart Mill makes a really interesting utilitarian critique of that point, but we'll talk about that in a second. So, really quickly, in order to contrast what Kant's up to with his ethical theory, you have to talk about the notion of categorical, or excuse me, hypothetical imperatives. Hypothetical imperatives. So, hypothetical imperative pertains to something that you want, right? So, if your goal is to eventually own a big house, 8 room mansion, right? 10 room mansion. Then what you ought to do is to study hard, get good grades, graduate, get a good job, work hard, save your money, and then get the house, right? Hypothetical. If you want this, do this, right? But morality is not hypothetical. Morality, on Kant's view, pertains to duty. And duty is, on Kant's view, categorical, meaning it pertains to what we have to do. And so there are 4 formulations of what are known as the categorical imperative. We're not going to worry about the last 2, but what we are very concerned about are the first 2 formulations of the categorical imperative. So the first formulation of the categorical imperative goes like it's thus: act always on that maxim. A maxim just means a rule. Act always on that maxim that you can, at the same time, will to be a universal law without contradiction. Okay, so that needs some unpacking. What is he talking about? What Kant is essentially saying, in paraphrase, is this: if you're not prepared to see everyone else act as you've just acted, then you shouldn't perform that action. So he gives the example of someone who borrows money, knowing that they can't possibly pay it back, right? So they made a promise and they know they have no intention of keeping the promise. And Kant asks, what would happen if everyone made promises that they couldn't keep? Well, what would happen is that eventually trust would break down. You can't have a functioning society without trust. So if you want a functioning society, you can't make promises that you have no intention of keeping, right? Now, this is where, as I mentioned, Mill makes an interesting critique, right? And Mill was writing, several decades after Kant had died, and he said, look, Kant says morality is all about the intentions behind the action, but why can't we make promises, on his view, that we have no intention of keeping? Not because the intentions are bad, but because the consequences would be bad. I think it's a very, very good criticism. The second formulation of the categorical imperative: always treat humanity, whether in the form of yourself or that of any other person, always as an end in itself and never as a mere means. So what's Kant talking about? You can use inanimate objects, right? A pen, a computer, a phone, an ATM, it doesn't matter because they're tools. Tools are meant to be used. Human beings, however, are not tools and are not meant to be used. When you're dealing with a human being, on Kant's view, you have to always assume you're dealing with an entity like yourself, that is to say, a creature that is rational, that has goals, plans, expectations, etc., relationships. You treat them like yourself. Now, that having been said, a lot of people say, well, okay, so he's basically restating the golden rule. No, Kant does not like the so-called golden rule. Don't do unto others as you would not have them do unto you. Confucius famously advances this, Rabbi Hillel. It's not what Kant's saying. Kant actually hates the golden rule because he thinks the golden rule makes morality a matter of incentive, right? If what's another way to put this? Inclination. If you're inclined, right, to hurt other people and you don't care if they hurt you back or you're indifferent to it, then you'll do whatever, right? Kant wants morality to be about duty. Now, what exactly does a second formulation of categorical imperative mean? Well, we can paraphrase it in 3 words, right? Don't exploit people. Now, this is significant because at a time, Kant's writing in the late 18th century, right? At the time he's writing this, human beings are literally being treated like tools. Slavery is legal and widespread, right? So at a time when not many other people were critiquing slavery, Kant offered up a critique of slavery. And that's not to say that Kant was the most enlightened guy. He has unfortunate views on women and people of color, and this should be noted too, whereas the utilitarian philosophers had advanced views on the rights of animals and how animals should be treated based on, hedonistic considerations. Kant does not believe that we owe any moral duties. We have no moral obligations toward the non-human animals whatsoever. Why not? Because they're not rational. And only rational beings can be moral. So far as we know, that means, on Kant's view, only human beings can be moral. Now, this day and age, it's much, much more difficult, in fact, impossible, to say that the non-human animals lack rationality. One might argue that they lack rationality to the extent that human beings have it, but they definitely have it. And crows, for example, just to give you an example of an animal that is extremely rational, exhibit some very complex behaviors, many which would be identified as moral behaviors. One last little bit about Kant. Kant divides our duties into what are known as perfect and imperfect moral duties. An imperfect moral duty is one that you should fulfill if you have either the time or the resources, right? So if you are extremely talented, you're an excellent piano player, then you should, if you can, develop that talent. The world needs talented people. If you have the resources, then you should give the charity, right? Now, contrast that with perfect moral duties. Perfect moral duties are duties that you must never fail to fulfill. So, in other words, you should always act so as to preserve human life. Contrastly, there are things that you can't do, and these are also perfect moral duties. You should never murder. With one exception, Kant thinks if you're a criminal who has taken a human life, then you should be executed. He's what's known in the philosophy of justice as a retributivist. Let the punishment fit the crime, etc. Kant infamously states, don't lie. And when Kant says you can't tell a lie, he means you can never, ever tell a lie, not for any reason. You can't tell little white lies to spare people's feelings. You must never, ever tell a lie. Now, this was immediately objected to. Hey, Emmanuel, this seems like this is a really ridiculous stricture. And Kant says if everyone consistently told the truth, it wouldn't be so difficult. And he's got a point there, but people are going to lie to avoid conflicts, spare feelings, etc. I mean, people lie for complex reasons. So Kant's view has come under some serious scrutiny with respect to that. But that's Kantian ethics in a nutshell. It's a really rich theory. I don't agree with much of it myself, but that's perfectly fine. I have my reasons for that. Uh, but the next theory that we're going to talk about is much older than Kantian ethics or even utilitarianism for that, and it originated in simultaneously in ancient Greece and in ancient China with Aristotle and Confucius respectively, and that is virtue ethics. So we'll take a look at that next.